Everybody I know complains about Northern Virginia, the traffic, the housing prices, the ambition, the pressure, the endless busyness. And yet, almost nobody leaves, or at least not permanently. That's the paradox of Northern Virginia. People move here saying, we're only staying 2 or 3 years. And then suddenly, they've been here 19 years, their kids are in Fairfax County schools, they own patio furniture that cost more than their first couch, and they're passionately debating whether Vienna, McLean, or North Arlington gives better long-term value. After more than 20 years as a realtor here and 30 years living in Northern Virginia, I finally realized why this happens. Northern Virginia gets the boring things right that much of America is increasingly getting wrong. Stability, competence, infrastructure, career opportunity, education, safety, and economic resilience. And once people build a life around those things, it becomes very difficult to walk away. Here's the truth. Northern Virginia is not usually the place people fantasize about. Nobody sits in a Manhattan apartment saying, you know where I really want to reinvent myself emotionally? Reston. That's not the vibe. This isn't Miami. This isn't Nashville. This isn't Austin. Northern Virginia doesn't seduce people emotionally. It absorbs them practically. And over time, practical starts becoming very attractive, especially once people hit their late 30s and their 40s. In this video, I want to talk about why so many New Yorkers quietly stay here in Northern Virginia, why Californians increasingly move here, why people leave for Florida and sometimes come back, why Northern Virginia real estate stays expensive, why the schools, economy, and infrastructure matter more than people admit, and why this region may quietly be one of the best long-term lifestyle markets in America, even if people here complain about it nonstop. And later, I'm going to explain what I call the Florida Boomerang effect, why some Northern Virginia professionals move away chasing lower taxes and sunshine, only to realize they missed something they didn't fully appreciate until it was gone. But first, you have to understand the deeper thing Northern Virginia gets right. Northern Virginia functions at a very high level. And I know functional sounds boring until you live somewhere that isn't. Then suddenly it becomes one of the most attractive qualities imaginable, especially once adulthood becomes serious. Marriage, children, career pressure, aging parents, health concerns, and economic anxiety. At that point, people stop optimizing purely for excitement and start optimizing for life stability. That's where Northern Virginia shines. The schools are strong. The healthcare systems are excellent. The parks are maintained. The libraries are phenomenal. The economy is diversified, and the communities generally feel safe and orderly. People massively underestimate how psychologically calming that is. I've had clients move here from parts of California and quietly say, I didn't realize how much low-grade stress I was carrying around every day. Not because California lacks beauty. California is stunning, especially along the coast. But some people get exhausted by instability, rising crime concerns, impossible housing economics, and long-term uncertainty. Northern Virginia feels grounded, structured, predictable. For many families, that becomes deeply valuable. One reason Northern Virginia real estate stays strong over time, this region has multiple economic engines operating simultaneously. While other major cities often depend heavily on one major industry, Northern Virginia has government, defense, cybersecurity, law, consulting, healthcare, technology, intelligence, international business, and higher education, all feeding the economy at the same time. Detroit has historically leaned heavily on auto. Vegas leans heavily on tourism. Houston leans heavily on energy. Northern Virginia doesn't just rely on one thing. It has layers of economic insulation. That's one reason this region tends to bend instead of completely collapse during downturns. I remember the 2008 crash vividly. Northern Virginia absolutely suffered. But compare what happened here to parts of Florida, Arizona, Nevada, or inland California. Some markets were devastated. Entire subdivisions became ghost zones. Northern Virginia recovered faster because underneath the housing market was something powerful. High income, highly educated, career stable buyers. That matters tremendously in real estate. And yes, Northern Virginia is expensive, but context matters. $1 million in North Arlington, McLean, or Vienna often buys dramatically more lifestyle functionally than $1 million in Manhattan, Brooklyn, Silicon Valley, or parts of Boston. Buyers don't just compare prices anymore. Today, they compare schools, commute options, safety, taxes, space, long-term stability, infrastructure, and quality of daily life. And Northern Virginia scores surprisingly high across the board. One thing that's very different about Northern Virginia compared to many parts of America is the overall competence level. And I don't mean that arrogantly, I mean practically. People here are generally organized, educated, prepared, career-oriented, and systems aware. And that changes daily life. You feel it in the schools, the conversations, the businesses, the neighborhoods, the parenting culture, even in the restaurant scene. Yes, it can become exhausting, absolutely. There's definitely resume culture, achievement pressure, school obsession, networking fatigue, and overscheduling. But there's also tremendous upside. Northern Virginia still rewards intelligence and preparation. That's becoming rarer in some places. I've had open house conversations somehow drift into AI, foreign policy, education systems, cybersecurity, Supreme Court decisions, or international economics. That's very Northern Virginia. And for intellectually curious people, that environment becomes hard to leave. And this is important to understand before we get to the Florida boomerang effect later, because this life competence culture is one of the exact things many people unexpectedly miss after they leave. But Northern Virginia isn't just a machine for white-collar jobs. The global economy has also created one of the most authentically diverse daily cultures anywhere in the country. This region feels globally connected in a very real way, not performative, real. You can spend an afternoon getting Vietnamese coffee in Falls Church, shopping at H Mart, eating Afghan kebabs, and then finishing with Ethiopian food in Alexandria. And nobody thinks twice about it. That's just daily life here. I think Northern Virginia's food scene is dramatically underrated nationally. Dramatically. It reflects actual immigrant communities, not just trendy restaurant concepts. And for families, this environment is incredibly valuable. Kids here naturally grow up exposed to multiple cultures, languages, religions, and perspectives without it feeling forced. I remember a client from the Midwest years ago telling me something very interesting after having lived here for about 18 months. He said, "Brian, I don't think I realized how provincial my life felt before I moved here to Northern Virginia. Not because the Midwest lacks good people, it absolutely doesn't. But Northern Virginia exposes you constantly to international ideas, different cultures, high-level careers, and ambitious people from all over the world. And once some people experience that environment, they don't want to go backward." Now, let's talk about something I've seen repeatedly: the Florida boomerang effect. People get burned out here in Northern Virginia. The traffic, the pace, the costs, the winters. So they move to Florida. And sometimes it's absolutely the right decision. But other times, a few years later, they quietly realize they miss intellectual energy, career opportunity, strong public schools, walkability, educated peer groups, healthcare access, proximity to DC, structured infrastructure. Northern Virginia provides something subtle: momentum. This area creates forward movement, career movement, educational movement, social movement. And once people become accustomed to that, some other places begin to feel slower or less stimulating. People constantly ask, why are homes here in Northern Virginia so expensive? It's because demand here is durable. This area combines strong schools, high incomes, stable employment, international access, career opportunity, and proximity to DC, all in one market. And that combination is rare. And unlike boom towns built largely on hype, Northern Virginia has deep institutional roots. The Pentagon isn't leaving, federal ecosystem isn't disappearing, and cybersecurity is not vanishing. The legal and consulting infrastructure is not collapsing. That creates long-term confidence in Northern Virginia's housing market. Now, yes, You can absolutely buy bigger homes for less money in Texas, Florida, the Carolinas, or much of the Midwest. No question about that. But many buyers eventually realized they weren't just buying square footage here. They were buying stability, education, access, community, and long-term resilience. That's what keeps Northern Virginia valuable. Northern Virginia certainly isn't perfect. It's expensive, busy, ambitious, and sometimes exhausting. But this region quietly gets a lot right. Stability, opportunity, education, safety, diversity, economic resilience, infrastructure, long-term career mobility. And that's why so many people who move here temporarily end up staying for decades. Eventually they realize Northern Virginia may not always feel exciting, but it often feels dependable. And dependable has become surprisingly rare in America. If you live in Northern Virginia, I'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think this area gets right that outsiders misunderstand? And if you're considering a move here and you want honest guidance about neighborhoods, commute strategy, schools, lifestyle fit, or long-term real estate value, feel free to reach out.